Ruth chapter 2. So if you were with us last week, you know that we were talking about the beginning of Ruth, and just a quick reminder of the timing. The context is going to be very important for some of the things that are being said here in Ruth chapter 2. So we need to remember this is at the end of the book of Judges, right? This is a very, very dark time for Israel. Things have gotten really, really bad. Even though Moses was already here and the 10 Commandments came down and the law came down and they witnessed all these miracles and the manna and the quail and all these wonderful things have happened, despite all of that, the people still fell into a state of disbelief. They still fell into the worshiping of idols. And if you remember, one of the more common phrases, especially as we get to the end of the book of Judges, was, and they did what was right in their own eyes, right? They had given up following the ways of God. This is going to be important because of some of the things that are going to be coming up in here in Ruth chapter 2. Also, I made a note here because apparently I remember this. I forgot, and I couldn't remember what it was called. It's called the Tetragrammaton. That little, whenever you see that special kind of word, Lord, it's this special word that's only ever used for the name of God. In the Bible, and I wrote that down, and now I've told you. See, I'm not crazy. Verse 2, despite what Brittany says, chapter 2. Now there was too much silence there. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So if you remember, Elimelech was Naomi's husband. So this is a relative, right? The other thing that's notable here, he's of good standing. What did I just finish telling you about the rest of Israel right now? Things aren't good. In fact, if you remember, one of the last judges, it led to an all-out war against the tribe of Benjamin over a Levite cutting up a human being into pieces. Remember this? Things got dark. It got bad. And yet here we have a man, Boaz, who is a man of good standing. This is notable for a very big reason, because even when things were so dark, there are still people that are willing to do the right thing. Right? And if you remember, if you were with us last week, that's what we talked about. How Ruth, despite all the trials, all the despair as she was looking forward, all the darkness as she's looking forward, she said, no, I have a duty, I have a responsibility, I'm going to do the right thing, even if it looks like it's going to be terrible. She did the right thing. And now we have this man, Boaz, who is a man of good standing. And all the other things I said about him, don't worry, that'll be cleared up later on in the book, in the chapter. So it says, Ruth the Moabite, and they keep classifying that, the Moabite. This is going to be a big deal too, right? I've said this before. If they keep repeating a certain detail, it means we need to pay attention to it, especially when it's a little bit of an odd thing. Why do they keep saying she's a Moabite? Why is that a big deal? You'll find out. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Now maybe you've read the book of Leviticus and it's your favorite book and you know it front and back, and I'm getting no sarcastic nods. Leviticus chapter 19 verses 9 through 10. This was a widow's right. The way the law was written was that the edge of your fields and anything as you were putting together the sheaves, anything that fell off, anything that touched the ground, that now belongs to the poor. You must leave it. You are not to touch it. Right? So this practice, which Ruth is about to partake in, this is common. This is something that widows would have definitely done, because widows were definitely amongst the poor because their husbands had passed. As we talked about last week, the literal breadwinners, the ones that brought the food home, were gone, and so now the widows were the ones that would often be out in these fields gathering up grain so that they would have enough to eat, right? This was, I heard some other pastors call it this. They said it was God's first welfare program. This is a way to make sure that people actually were able to be fed, but you had to go out and earn it, right? It wasn't just given to you. You actually had to go out and gather it. And so Ruth gets prepared and goes out and to gather enough food for her and her mother-in-law. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and entered the field and began to glean behind the harvesters. And as it turned out, she was working in a field that belonged to Boaz, who is from the clan of Elimelech, right? So her father-in-law. Just then, Boaz, and so we're about to learn some stuff about Boaz here, right? All we know is he's a man of good standing. But as he arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters, he greeted the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Why is this a big deal? We're at the end of Judges. Things are really dark. A lot of the Hebrews are no longer following the law. They're worshiping idols. They're worshiping, at the shrines of Moloch and Baal and the Asherah poles and all that stuff. They're not following God. So when this man shows up and says this is revealing a lot about his character. This is a man who is after God. This is a man who takes his calling seriously. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" Now you can imagine, right? I just finished saying it would be common to see widows out in the field gathering up grain. But as we talked about last week, Ruth was still quite young, right? Maybe in her 20s. Right? She was very, very young. And yet, she is out there with the rest of the poor and the older widows gathering up grain. That would really stand out, right? That would catch your eye. Why is someone so young? A, not married, and B, doing the work of a widow, right? This is notable to everyone. So the overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, so this is Ruth said, "Please let me glean and gather amongst the sheaves behind the harvesters." So she came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Now we're going to learn more about who Ruth is. As I said, that was her right to be able to come in behind and glean and gather. God said that belongs to her. And yet, this is why I said this says a lot about her. Even though it was her right, she still comes and asks permission. This talks about the humility of Ruth. Right? And it's funny because it's one of those things, right? Maybe you don't have to ask, but it would be nice if you asked. Like, all of us have been in a situation like that. And it's like, well, someone doesn't ask you to dinner, but they asked everyone else, and you're like, well, why didn't you ask? They're like, well, I knew you wouldn't be around. It's like, yeah, but it would have been nice. Just extend the invitation. It's the courtesy. It's the act. So that's Ruth. Even though she had the right to something, she didn't just project that and say, you know what? No, it's my right. You can't tell me what to do, Boaz. No, she was very humble and full of grace. She came and she asked. And the other thing, she was a hard worker. She only took a short rest. Right? I don't know if any of you have ever worked a harvest and gone out and gathered. It sucks. It's hot and sweaty and dusty and gross. You want to stop and have a good break. The fact that she didn't says a lot about her. She was very determined and hardworking, and she was willing to put her nose to it. So we learned some things about Ruth. Verse 8, so Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." Yeah, other Bibles, depending on what you have, may just say "stay here with the women," but I think this is actually a good translation based on what he's about to say, which is, watch the field where the men and I are harvesting, and follow along after the women he's paying. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. A few things about this. Number one, he wanted to protect her. He knew they were in dark days. Things were not good. That even though his fields and his harvesters and although they may have been obeying the Lord, that many of his neighbors did not. That many of his neighbors partook in the Baal worship and the Asherah poles. That many of his neighbors, and this was a very common thing also at this time, would harass and assault these women that would come to try and glean from the fields. It wasn't exactly safe, right? That's why it was so revolutionary when the Bible, when God gave the law to Moses and said, "No, we're meant to protect these people." It was completely different than what the world had ever experienced. Boaz recognized that the rest of the world was not living as as the Lord had instructed him to do. And so he offers her protection. Stay here. Don't go away. You are more than welcome to stay. In fact, follow immediately after the women. And so if you're wondering why was there men and women working in this field? Again, if you've worked a harvest, maybe you know, maybe you don't. But so what would happen? The men would go forward with their sickles, and they're just cutting out the stalks, right? Because all you want is that little bit at the top, but you got to cut all the stalks. And so they would go and they would just be cutting and grabbing and kind of moving it aside. And then the women would come in behind, gather it into bundles or sheets, and they would tie it all up, and then it would sit there in the field to dry, right? And before he would take it to go get threshed. And so in all of that process, right, there's a lot of shaking and stuff like that. There was a lot of grain that would have fallen to the ground. And so it was a prime spot to be in if you wanted to go out and find food for yourself. She was essentially been given first dibs. Not only that, he implicitly told the men not to lay a hand on her. She was under, I want to say the Lord's protection, but I want you to understand, I'm not talking about God, but the Lord of the manor, right? Like the guy who's in charge, the masters. He was under his protection. Not only that, but the water, right? And you got to remember, because we're here in Ontario and water is just, fresh water is so abundant and available. There, you'd have to gather it up in cisterns. Maybe you could find a good well if you were lucky. But it was quite a bit of labor involved in order to transport water. So then he offers her this precious gift of fresh water as well. So at this, this is a big deal, right? He has just blessed her incredibly. So at this, of course, she has the right attitude here. What does she do? She bows down with her face to the ground. She could have said, "Thank you, that is my right to stay here. You can't tell me to go to another field." But then we would be reading about Karen and not Ruth. Instead, what we have is a woman who shows an act of humility and gratefulness. Right? Gratitude is the thing that is just so evident here. She bows down with her face to the ground, and she continues this character that we've been reading about. And she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you have noticed me, a foreigner?" Why is that important? Because you didn't have to be as good to a foreigner as you did to your fellow Hebrew. Right? Under the law, she would have known that, right? She married into a Hebrew family. She would have known about the law. Her husband certainly would have known about it. She would have known that they didn't have to be that good. In fact, whether it's today or then, we've always treated the outsiders differently. Why? Because what's different can be dangerous. So we don't like it when different things come in. And yet she's noticing, even though I'm different, even though I'm an outsider, you've taken notice of me and shown me favor. Boaz, verse 11, replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland, and you came to live with people that you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Remember that difficult choice I talked about last week that Ruth had to make? An impossible choice that most of us wouldn't have made. But she was so principled. And she stood by her values so strongly and so devoutly. And in the end, it paid off, didn't it? She had no guarantee, no promise of blessing coming in the future. But here's the thing. People of good, upright, moral character, all of us, when we hear about people like that, aren't those the kinds of people that we want to include in our own lives? Right? It's the people that are untrustworthy, that are dangerous, they're sketchy, and we're like, I don't know if I really want to include them. But whenever we hear about people that are willing to take a stand and be principled and stand for what they believe in, we go, you know what? That's a good person. That's a great person. The story of Ruth is spread, and Boaz is going, yeah, I've heard of this young woman. She is amazing. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. I love this verse because this often gets overlooked in the law as well, right? First off, we've talked about this a bit before because people will often say, well, the Bible condones slavery. Maybe. But slavery in the Bible is very, very different than what we think about as slavery in general. And you had to treat anyone under your service incredibly well. In fact, if you neglected someone in your service, the Bible demands that they be set free from you, no matter the debt that they owe you. Does not matter. You had to treat them well. And that's why she says this. I don't even have the standing of one of your servants. Why? Because even a servant, even a slave, had better standing than a foreigner or an outsider. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread, and dip it into wine vinegar. He continues to bless her. There's nothing in the law that says that you have to feed the people that are gleaning. This was his choice. He's going to share some of the things that he labored for, and that he paid for, and all this stuff. This is his land and his crop, and yet he's sharing it. And so when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain, and she ate all that she wanted, and then had some left over. This is going to come in later, this leftover grain. Then she finishes eating and immediately gets up and goes and gleans. So Boaz gave orders to her men. Let her gather among the sheaves. Remember what I said? They tie up the sheaves and leave them in the field. So they're still there. And they said, look, even if you see her go over to those sheaves and start taking grain out, do not reprimand her. Right? He's showing a lot of favor here. But I think he also recognized the character of Ruth, right? He recognized who she was, what she stood for, her principled nature. And so he continues on and says, even pull some stalks out for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, but don't rebuke her. I think he recognized, hey, she's not the kind that's going to come along and just start plucking them out. So instead he said, hey guys, go over there, take some out and just put them on the ground so that she'll feel comfortable going to get it. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. And then she threshed the barley that she had gathered. And it amounted to about an epath, about 30 pounds of grain. I had to think about this for a while, because I think it's a 20 kilo bag, so what's that, like 44 pounds? So I was like, man, of flour. I got one of those at home because I always buy the big thing. I was like, that's almost the size of flour. After one day, this is an incredible amount to glean, right? You remember, this is the leftovers, the garbage, if you will, on the field. So she carries it back into town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she gathered. Can you imagine her eyes as she came in? She's probably hoping for enough to eat for the night. And all of a sudden she comes in with this great big sack of grain. Ruth also brought out and gave to her what she had left over. Those leftovers she had back at lunch. She said, oh, here, you don't even have to you don't even have to prepare this grain. Here, I still have some from lunch that you can have. And she left it, and she gave it after she had eaten enough. Ruth also brought out, gave it to her, what she had left over after she had eaten enough. And her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? As you can imagine, this is incredible. First off, where are these terrible workers at that they're making such a mess? Like, how did you get so much? Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked for today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing kindness to his kindred, to the living and the dead. Right? She immediately recognizes this name. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. And a guardian redeemer is a legal term in the Hebrew code, right? In the law, That meant you were someone who had an obligation to redeem a relative who had been in serious difficulty. If you remember, right, we talked about it last week, Naomi recognized her line is over, right? Her sons are dead. Her husband is dead. There is no hope for the line to continue for her. Her family name is over. And yet here she comes home. She gets to Bethlehem, and lo and behold, this guardian redeemer appears. And it looks like her suddenly Naomi, who wanted to be called Mara because she had become so bitter, suddenly has reason to rejoice again. Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all of my grain.' And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, 'It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed.'" Right? I said that before. It was dangerous to be can you imagine? People say that we got a problem now. You imagine at a time when there's no police, not even really any soldiers at this point. It's just people being barbaric and terrible to each other. Yet she recognized she had safety if she stayed with this in this man's field. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz and gleaned until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished. And I can only imagine if she got 30 pounds of barley after one day, man, she must have had more than enough by the end of this harvest to be fed for the rest of the year. And she lived with her mother-in-law. A couple things that we'll talk about just before we close in prayer here. Number one, God will bless your sacrifice. And he blesses your integrity. Right? Sometimes it's hard to look difficult times in the face when you have when you try and live by your principles and you try and take an integral stance and you say, I don't want to bend, I don't want to flex. God called me to this and I cannot change it. God will reward that. And the other thing, one of my biggest takeaways as I was going through this, every time I go through this part of Ruth, is how important it is that we don't lose a humble and gracious heart. Those were her two greatest assets, her humility and her graciousness to everyone that she was interacting with. Again, do you think Boaz would have had the same reaction if when he came over and said, "Oh, where are you from?" And she said, "You can't tell me what to do. Get out of here. It's my right to be here." We'd probably be reading a very different story. And yet that tends to be a reflex in our society today, doesn't it? Instead of just being gracious and humble, recognizing where we are, who we are, and being loving, kind, gentle to those around us. It's an important thing that we deal with each and every day. And I hope that each and every one of us, when we wake up in the morning, that we take that into consideration. Is my heart tender today? Am I keeping it soft? Or am I going to allow myself to become hard and jaded and angry? Right? Keep a close eye on that. Don't allow that. And that's why church is so important. Because we can be there for each other. Man, I'm feeling full of anger and bitterness, and life is so difficult. There are people here that want to share that burden with you and talk to you and help you and love you. But you don't do that in isolation. It's part of a community.